Hello and welcome to Chapter 5. This will cover the first 2 years in terms of biosocial development. What will you learn in this chapter? What part of an infant grows most in the first 2 years? Are babies essentially blind and deaf at birth? What happens if a baby does not get his or her vaccinations? First, we're going to cover body changes. Up until year 1, birth weight doubles by the 4th month and triples by 1 year. There's a substantial variation though. The typical newborn grows 10 inches by age 1, and average at birth, weight 7 pounds and length about 20 inches. From the first year to the second year, physical growth slows, and at age 2, 1/2 adult height and 1/5 adult weight. Alright, we'll cover norms and percentiles. Norms are defined standards of typical performance. These represent average measurements, and individuals vary. You may have heard percentiles be used in terms of children and growing. This is a number that indicates rank compared to other similar people of the same age. Percentiles range from 0 to 100. Norms and percentiles are useful. Most 1-month-old girls weigh 10 pounds and should be at least 25 pounds by age 2. Although females weigh less than males on average lifelong, it is obvious that individuals do not always follow the norms. Same boy, much changed. All 3 photos show Connor, first at 3 months, then at 12 months, and finally at 24 months. Note the rapid growth in the first 2 years, especially apparent in the changing proportions of the head compared to the body and use of the legs. And now we'll discuss patterns of infant sleep. Newborns average 15 to 17 hours a day. Over the early weeks, REM sleep and traditional sleep decline rapidly, and slow wave sleep increases. Individual differences due to maturation, genes, and environment occur, and caregiver response to infant behavior during sleep hours also impacts sleep patterns. Insufficient sleep may be a problem for parents and the infant, mostly for the parents. Alright, we'll discuss co-sleeping and bed sharing. In Asian, Latin American, and African nations, mothers worry more about separation. European and North American mothers worry about privacy and sex. Some cohort differences include pros and cons. For the pros, there's a quick response time, and is related to increased response attachment. On the cons list, there is higher SIDS risk, that's sudden infant death syndrome, and later sleep pattern problems. Moving on to brain development. The brain is the fastest growing organ. Brain growth affects later cognition, and head sparring occurs when the body is physically challenged. Head sparing. It's to protect the brain. In terms of connections in the brain, that involves neurons. A neuron is one of billions of nerve cells in the central nervous system, or CNS. Communication with the CNS begins with neurons. Most neurons are created before birth, at a peak production rate of 250,000 new cells per minute in mid-pregnancy. And in infancy, the human brain has billions of neurons. Alright, here's an image. This is the color staining aspect on this photo makes it obvious that the 2 cell bodies of neurons stained in chartreuse grow axons and dendrites to each other's neurons. This tangle is repeated thousands of times in every human brain. Throughout life, those fragile dendrites will grow or disappear as the person continues thinking. All right, we've discussed the neuron a little bit here, but let's get to some basic terms of neurological development. Some of this might be a refresher. The axon is the fiber that extends from the neuron and transmits electrochemical impulses from that neuron to the dendrites of other neurons. A dendrite is a fiber that extends from a neuron and receives electrochemical impulses transmitted from other neurons via their axons. The synapse is the intersection between the axon of one neuron and the dendrites of other neurons. And neurotransmitters, these are brain chemicals that carry information from the axon of a sending neuron to the dendrites of a receiving neuron. Neurons and synapses proliferate. They increase rapidly in number before birth. This increase continues at a fast pace after birth, but soon an opposite phenomenon occurs: the elimination or pruning of unnecessary connections. The last part of the brain to mature is the prefrontal cortex. This is the area for anticipation, planning, and impulse control. Continuing on, a myelin is the coating around an axon that speeds neuron transmission. The cortex is the outer layers of the brain where most thinking, feeling, and sensing occurs. The prefrontal cortex is the area of the cortex at the very front of the brain that specializes in anticipation, planning, and impulse control, as I mentioned. And the limbic system. These are brain parts that interact to produce emotions, including the amygdala, hypothalamus, and the hippocampus. Many other parts of the brain are also involved with emotions. The amygdala is a tiny structure that registers emotions, particularly fear and anxiety. All right, move on to some of the terms I just used. The hippocampus is the central processor of memory, especially memory for locations. The hypothalamus responds to the amygdala and hippocampus to produce hormones that activate other parts of the brain and body, such as cortisol. This is a primary stress hormone whose fluctuations affect human emotions. And the pituitary gland, it responds to signals from the hypothalamus by hormone production. And here's a slice of the brain. Show some of the things I just spoke about. A few of the hundreds of named parts of the brain are shown here. Although each area has particular functions, the entire brain is interconnected. The processing of emotions, for example, occurs primarily in the limbic system, where many brain areas are involved, including the amygdala, hippocampus, and hypothalamus. All right, to go on about brain development. Transient exuberance is followed by pruning. Early dendrite growth is called transient exuberance. Exuberance because it is so rapid, and transient because some of it is temporary. The brain contains great excess of neurons at birth. A newborn brain has fewer dendrites, axons, and synapses and much less myelin than an adult brain. A great but temporary increase in the number of dendrites develop in the infant's brain during the first 2 years of life, again called transient exuberance. Unused dendrites wither postnatally to allow space between neurons in the brain, allowing more synapses and thus more complex thinking. Experience shapes the brain. Necessary and possible experiences. This is separated into two categories: experience expectant and experience dependent. In experience expectant brain function, certain functions require basic experiences in order to develop, just as a tree requires water. Those experiences are a part of almost every infant's life, and thus almost every human brain grows as human genes direct. Brains need and expect such experiences. Development would suffer without them. In experience-dependent brain function, some brain functions depend on particular experiences. These specific experiences are not essential. They happen to infants in some families and cultures, but not in others. Because of experience-dependent experiences, humans can be quite different from one another, yet all fully human. Examples from language development studies show that human babies learn language much like birds learn songs. Adults talk, and baby brains expect a culturally specific language. In examples from bird brains, birds inherit genes that produce brain cells they need to learn new songs or find hidden seeds. For the dendrites and neurons to connect, birds depend on specific experiences with song learning or seed finding. Iona is not Flora. If you heard that Dario was not Luis or Boris, would you stare at unfamiliar monkey faces more closely in the future? For 6-month-olds, the answer is yes. Alright, an area of the brain that is used for facial recognition is called the fusiform face area of the brain. This makes newborn infants adept at face recognition. Experiences refine face perception and trigger immediate recognition over time. There's also such a thing as own race effect and is an apparent before first birthday and persists throughout life. This is when babies recognize the faces of their own race over others. Harming the infant brain. Necessary stimulation is required for the brain to develop. This includes playing, and it allows varied sensations and encourages movement and is necessary for brain connections. In terms of stress in the brain, overabundance of stress hormones can damage later brain functioning. In severe social deprivation, anecdotal evidence with human children and research with other mammals confirms that isolation and sensory deprivation harm the developing brain. In intervention, the shaken baby syndrome is a life-threatening injury that occurs when an infant is forcefully shaken back and forth. This motion ruptures blood vessels in the brain and breaks neural connections. Infants have an inborn drive to remedy deficits in terms of self-righting. It is the patterns, not the moments, or of neglect or maltreatment that harm the brain. Understanding development as dynamic and interactive means helping caregivers from the start, not waiting until destructive patterns are established. And that concludes part 1 of chapter 5.